One of the things I've been mulling over and struggling with over the past several years is the social, political, and cultural divide in America. I just don't like it, and I don't think anyone does. I want people to get along with each other, for everyone to play nicely in the same sandbox, because we have a lot of challenges in our world that need our attention and that require us to work together to solve them. It can feel exhausting to navigate all the differences, especially if we have them in our own families and among our friends, and this dynamic just doesn't seem to be getting any easier. So we tend to gravitate toward people who agree with us, where we feel we have a safe space to be, and that means we veer away from those people whose ideas we find disagreeable. And that makes sense. Why should anyone willingly place themselves in an uncomfortable situation? I do that as much as anybody. There are people in my life where I know it's the best policy to ensure domestic tranquility just to avoid certain topics altogether. Even talking about the weather, that might start up a debate about whether climate change is real. It used to be safe to discuss sports, but if you're not really careful, that could devolve into an argument about taking a knee during the national anthem. And that's with the people I know and love. My larger problem is, in spite of myself, I realize that sometimes I profile complete strangers before I even get the chance to know them. If they're wearing a hat with a certain slogan, or their car has a certain bumper sticker on it, or I overhear them making a comment, I can make all kinds of instant assumptions that that person is an arch conservative, or they're a flaming liberal. That person is someone I would have a lot in common with, or they're someone I would just rather not bother with. Now, all my life, I've told myself it's necessary to walk a mile in someone else's shoes before I can presume to really know them. But, these days it feels increasingly risky to even ask to borrow their shoes, metaphorically speaking. And so, instead of engagement, there's avoidance. And any possibility of bridging a gap, of finding common ground, well, it simply doesn't have a chance to happen. And that feels to me like an abdication of responsibility. Because loving your neighbor as yourself is, I think, our most important responsibility. And it's clearly much harder to love someone if you don't understand who they are. And we know the inverse of that is true. It's easier to be suspicious of someone, to fear someone, or to even hate and demonize someone if you don't really know them personally. That's why during times of war, it's a very common tactic to dehumanize the enemy, to place such a distance between who you are and who they are that their humanity is diminished to nothing, so that they become more of a caricature than a real person. I love history, and in recent years, I've read whole bookshelves worth of material that illustrates what we've been experiencing in the past few years in America. It actually is nothing new. Divisions based on class, religion, ethnicity, race, and gender, between the powerful and those without power, between competing views of economics, between concepts like individual liberty and social responsibility, those kinds of divisions all run like a river through our history. I don't believe it's unpatriotic to admit that we are imperfect, that we have not and we do not always live up to our ideals, and that we are a work in progress. It's helpful to know that every movement toward justice and fairness and equality has met with stiff resistance. It's important to learn about the race riots 100 years ago in Tulsa. And knowing the truth about dark moments like that doesn't bring us down. It helps bring all of us into the light. It's important, especially as we celebrate Pride this month, to learn about the early days of the Pride movement and how that's helped change so many hearts and minds toward acceptance of LGBTQ persons. It's safe to say that churches like Salem would not be open and affirming today if not for the decades of hard, persistent effort by activists pointing out the sad truth that people have faced horrible discrimination because of how they are created by God, and they still do face that discrimination. That's why I'm really excited that we're hosting this Thursday an online event with Mark Segal, one of the pioneers of Pride. Learning about that struggle helps us understand why it's so crucial for us to continue standing up for what's right and to keep fighting for those rights that are being threatened every single day. And it's important to know that so many of our social institutions, like churches, for instance, have stood both on the dark side of history and have helped lead the way toward the light. But knowing all that only goes so far. I have to ask myself, as a person who's supposed to be all about doing the right thing and loving my neighbor and helping make my community and the world a better place than I found it, what am I actually doing about that? And I don't mean as a minister, I mean as a citizen, as a person, as a grown-up, as someone who cares about the future for my kids and grandkids and yours. You know, the Apostle Paul's mission in life was to create communities of people who adopted a brand new worldview where serving the needs of others came before serving your own needs. And the growth of Christianity was a testament to the appeal of that concept. Your example and guide in that quest was an itinerant Jewish teacher and healer named Jesus, whose consistent message was to give yourself away in love with no limits, no qualifications. And that was especially true for those whom you rather avoid, because they didn't think like you, or believe like you, or behave like you. It's easy enough, Jesus said, to get along just fine with your own tribe, the folks in your own echo chamber, but where the rubber hits the road is in reaching out to and welcoming and embracing the people that you'd rather not reach, welcome, or embrace. It's in doing that, it's in putting yourself out there and taking those risks when we discover life's true meaning and purpose. And in the cultural context of the Roman Empire back when Paul was alive, and most every empire ever conceived, what that was and still is a radical concept. Most societies are structured by hierarchies, distinctions of class, race, ethnicity, education, gender, religion, country of origin, and in any hierarchy, by definition, there are inequalities and injustice. But Christianity, at least in its earliest and purest form, reached across and broke down those distinctions. Remember the famous line from Paul's letter to the Galatians? He writes, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, neither male nor female. We're all as one in Christ Jesus." And that all sounds great. It sounds like a society and a world where people understand that we have a lot more in common with each other, and that transcends our differences. That, at our core, we're all human beings who embody light and love, dignity and value, and we all share the same basic needs and hopes and dreams. Being human means we all exist in a realm of love, to know love and to give love and to be awakened to the love that knits us all together. You know, one of my favorite writers, the Franciscan priest Richard Rohr, calls that truth the universal Christ. It's something we spend our whole lives discovering and rediscovering, both in ourselves and in each other. And I think that is what Paul was writing about. But being human also means we're very prone to self-protection and security. Loving others as we love ourselves and not seeing the differences among each other as barriers, that requires a level of vulnerability and self-confidence that a lot of us are not comfortable with. It feels far safer to know we belong to a people, a tribe, a race, a class, a religion, a nation, and a political and a social perspective, and to define ourselves in those ways, to distinguish ourselves from those who are different. To be able to say, if there's an us, that means there must be a them. A year or two after Paul wrote to the Galatians, he wrote a couple of letters to the Christian church in Corinth. In some ways, he was telling them the same thing he was telling the Galatians. But the Corinthians, for all they knew about the way of Jesus, all the ways they wanted to help create a world where old barriers between people were broken down, a world where everyone was treated with justice and mercy and understood as beloved by God. The very reason they were drawn to this movement in the first place, well, what were they up to in practice? Those Corinthians were busy creating hierarchies. They were categorizing people, profiling and pigeonholing them based on their differences. They were in their very own church community perpetuating the very things that the one they claimed to follow had taught were silly and unnecessary and a waste of energy and not at all reflective of God's inclusive love for all people. So Paul tells them, guys, look, I know you're trying, but you're missing the whole point. You're still looking at each other and at humanity from the old, worn-out point of view. It's understandable. We're only human after all. But think of it this way. If you're living as Christ lived and taught, it's as if you're a brand new creation. Everything old has passed away, and everything has become new. Now, I don't think Paul probably had any illusions that try as he might, his words might fall on some deaf ears. That old insecurities and fears would keep some folks from living like new creations. But his words are still here, and they're some of the best known in human history. So that indicates the staying power of an ideal. The ideal that even if we fall short of it a lot of the time, at least we know what to shoot for. And that is a world and a nation and a community and families and relationships where we live into the universal love that we know in our bones is there if we only wake up to it and act on it. The love that breaks down barriers and moves through differences. The love that sees that annoying hat or bumper sticker, or that hears the absurd comment or political or social opinion that we could never agree with, but that can still see the beloved human being inside of those things anyway. It's a love confident enough and vulnerable enough to reach out to and welcome and embrace the love within that person, because that love is far stronger and more enduring than anything else. Now, I am not naive. If anything, I am world weary. And I guess that's why I'm also so weary of the pigeonholing and profiling and holding in suspicion of anyone anymore. It's exhausting, and it's not how any of us are created or called to live and regard our neighbor. I can still stand up and say what I believe to be true and work for that, but that's different from assuming that someone who's my neighbor is someone I would have a really hard time loving. That is a waste of my time and energy and a disregard of what love is for. You might have seen Sally Cohn on TV. She is an outspoken writer and commentator who's appeared on Fox and on CNN. A few years ago, she wrote a book called The Opposite of Hate, a field guide to repairing our humanity. On TV, Sally goes to bat for progressive issues. She's a liberal feminist lesbian. And especially when she appears on Fox, she gets a lot of hate mail from viewers. She says that it's not always easy to respond in equal measure to these ugly, profanity-laced emails. But she has what she calls a spiritual practice. She challenges herself to find the compassion for others that she would want them to have for her. Sound familiar? Sally seeks to understand those who disagree with her. She dialogues with them. She finds common ground with them. She learns what they care about and why that matters to them. She discovers their fears and insecurities and recognizes her own. She sees herself in them. And in doing that, she says she is optimistic. Because she doesn't only get hate mail, but plenty of nice letters too. She says, one of her all-time favorite letters began, I'm not a big fan of your political leanings or your sometimes tortured logic, but I am a big fan of you as a person. Sally says that while the man who wrote that doesn't agree with her, and even though they've never met in person, they have formed a connection. They see the humanity, the love, the universal Christ in each other, and that can lead to real change. I want to be that optimistic too, that the change we all need will come. But I also know it's up to each of us to make that happen. So let's be confident together, and let's take the step of seeking and finding that universal love that we know is there in every beloved neighbor, so that we can all live as God intends for us, as new creations.